During a live broadcast charity event, a millionaire businessman was kidnapped by masked men in front of hundreds of people. After 8 hours of fruitless searching, a 17-year-old girl living on the streets tugged at a police officer's sleeve, crying, "I know where he is." Initially ignored for being just a beggar, she managed to lead the officers to an abandoned warehouse. When they opened the container, the policeman fell into despair and had to call for reinforcements. The night air, usually heavy with the city's cocktail of exhaust and street food, was thick with the expensive perfume of high society socialites and the subtle aroma of canapes circulating on silver platters. Hidden in the shadows of a marble alcove, 17-year-old Leah, whose wiry frame made her look closer to 12, watched the spectacle of light and luxury. For her, this charity gala wasn't about donations or inspiring speeches. It was an opportunity, a chance to find a forgotten plate of food or a generous heart that might offer her a few bucks without a look of contempt. Her stomach growled, a silent protest against the opulence surrounding her. Camera flashes created momentary stars, illuminating smiling faces and jewelry worth more than she could dream of in 1,000 lifetimes. The center of all that attention was a man with salt and pepper hair and a kind smile, Arthur Sterling. His name was synonymous with wealth, a billionaire whose fortune was legendary. They spoke of his vast net worth, his stock market investments that always seemed to multiply, and how he used his immense capital to fund children's hospitals. Leah didn't understand business or the stock market, but she understood kindness, and in that man's eyes, projected onto a giant screen, she saw a goodness that seemed genuine. He took the stage to a storm of applause. The spotlights converged on him, creating an almost sacred aura. He approached the microphone, and the ballroom fell silent, everyone eager to hear the words of the man who turned money into hope. Leah shrank further into the darkness, feeling like an intruder, a stain on the perfect fabric of the evening. Arthur opened his mouth to begin his speech, a warm smile lighting up his face, and it was in that exact instant that her world and the world of everyone there shattered. From the blackness of an unlit side street, a black van emerged like a nocturnal predator. Tires squealed on the asphalt, and the doors slid open before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop. Masked men, moving with terrifying precision, leaped out. Panic erupted in the ballroom. Sharp screams cut through the air. Crystal glasses shattered on the floor. Before any security could react, the men were on the stage. They grabbed Arthur Sterling with brutal force. His smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and confusion. Leah saw everything, paralyzed by terror. Her instincts, honed by years of survival on the streets, screamed at her to run, to disappear, to become invisible, as she always did. But her feet felt nailed to the cold floor. She watched, wide-eyed, as the kind man was dragged off the stage, a helpless doll in the hands of those dark figures. He was thrown into the van with a violence that made Leah feel a pang of pain in her own body. The doors slammed shut with a dull, final thud. In less than 30 seconds, the black van had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of chaos, fear, and a silent question echoing in everyone's mind. But Leah, the girl nobody saw, the invisible witness in the shadows, wasn't asking what had happened. She had seen, she knew, and now, the knowledge of what she'd witnessed was a terrifying burden, a secret that burned in her chest as the sound of the first sirens began to cut through the night. Fleeing was the only logical answer, but the image of Mr. Sterling's kind eyes, now filled with dread, refused to leave her mind. Chaos settled in like a sudden storm. Screams, sirens, and the intermittent flash of red and blue lights painted the night with despair. For Leah, however, chaos was an old friend, a cloak she could disappear under. As the crowd swarmed, pointing and speaking in shocked tones, she retreated into the deeper shadows, moving with the silent agility of a startled animal. Every fiber of her being, sharpened by years of forced invisibility, urged her to run. Getting involved with the police was unthinkable. To the world, she wasn't a witness. She was a problem, a statistic, someone to be shooed away. She blended into the darkness of the back alleys, her heart still hammering in her chest. The sound of sirens became a distant drone, the soundtrack to a world she didn't belong to. She found refuge in her makeshift shelter, a gap behind an old bakery where the warmth from the industrial oven offered some comfort against the pre-dawn chill. There, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, she tried to erase the image of the black van, tried to forget Mr. Sterling's face. But the memory was stubborn. The hours dragged on, slow and cold. The city, which never truly slept, seemed to be holding its breath. Every so often, the sweep of a patrol car's light would wash over the entrance to her alley, and she would curl up tighter, fear chilling her bones. From snippets of conversation carried on the wind and the headlines flashing on storefront TVs, she gathered that the search was massive. The entire police force was mobilized. Helicopters chopped through the sky, but there were no leads. The man whose fortune was so vast they spoke in billions, whose net worth spanned continents, had simply vanished. All that money, all that wealth, meant nothing against the brutality of those masked men. Leah thought of the irony. She, who didn't have a penny, was free in her dirty alley, while the billionaire was trapped somewhere, terrified. The image of his eyes, kind and then frightened, returned with full force. It was the goodness in them that haunted her. She'd seen plenty of rich men, with their cold, distant gazes, but he was different. The compassion on his face on that stage had seemed real. 8 hours. The sky began to lighten, turning from deep black to a sickly grey. The smell of fresh bread started to leak from the bakery, an aroma that would normally make her daydream, but today only churned her anxious stomach. The city was waking up to the shocking news. The police, with all their technology and resources, were lost. And she knew she had the missing piece. The knowledge was an unbearable weight. If she stayed silent, she would be safe. No one would ever know she was there. But what about the man? What if the kidnappers hurt him? What if something worse happened? Her conscience, a voice she often had to silence to survive, was now screaming. Doing the right thing felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her life was a daily struggle, and drawing attention was the most dangerous mistake someone in her position could make. But silence also had a price. The price of living with the knowledge that she could have helped and chose not to. A single, hot tear traced a path down her grimy cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a decision forming in her heart. It was a monumental risk, a gamble that could destroy the little she had. But she couldn't bear the weight of her silence any longer. Trembling, she stood up, stepped out of her alley, and looked at the awakening street. In the distance, she saw a lone police officer standing by his patrol car, a coffee cup in his hand and exhaustion etched on his face. That was him. He was her chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild beat of dread and determination. It was now or never. The distance between the alley and the police officer seemed like an uncrossable chasm. Every step Leah took toward the uniformed figure was a battle against years of self-preservation. The officer, a middle-aged man with shoulders slumped from exhaustion, seemed lost in his own thoughts, oblivious to the small figure approaching with the hesitation of a frightened deer. The cold morning air pricked at her thin skin, but it was the ice of fear in her veins that made her tremble. She stopped a few feet from him, her voice caught in her throat. The words she'd rehearsed in her mind vanished, leaving only the sound of her own heart pounding in her ears. He glanced up, his gaze passing over her without really seeing her, the kind of look she knew so well, that categorized and dismissed her in a single second. Just another panhandler, his eyes seemed to say. His expression hardened into a mask of professional impatience. "Move along, kid. I don't have time for this today," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Before she could even open her mouth, the contempt in his tone was like a punch to the gut, nearly sending her retreating back to her familiar shadows. But the image of Mr. Sterling, bound and afraid, propelled her forward. I know, she stammered, her voice a faint whisper. I know where he is. The officer sighed, a long, exasperated sound. He took a sip of his coffee, clearly uninterested. Look, kid, the whole city's looking for him. The last thing we need is people making up stories for attention or a few bucks. The words stung, but she held on to her resolve. She took another step, her hand reaching out instinctively, thin, dirty fingers gripping the sleeve of his uniform. The physical contact seemed to startle him. He looked down at her hand on his arm with a barely disguised expression of revulsion. "Let go of me," he ordered, his voice sharper now. Leah felt tears well up, a mix of fear, frustration, and desperation. "Please, sir," she pleaded, the tears now streaming freely down her face, leaving clean tracks in her dusty skin. "I saw it. I was there. I saw the van. I saw where they went. He doesn't have much time." Her cry was raw and genuine, the sound of a breaking heart. Something in the intensity of her desperation finally seemed to pierce the officer's wall of skepticism. He studied her for a moment, his gaze shifting from annoyed to uncertain. Maybe it was the panic in her eyes, or the way she was trembling uncontrollably. He frowned. "You're telling me you know where Arthur Sterling is?" Leah nodded vigorously, unable to speak through her sobs. "They took him to an old place, a warehouse, near the train tracks. There's a rusty gate with a bird on it." The details were too specific to be made up on the spot. The officer, Sergeant Miller, felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in hours, a possibility. He was still skeptical, but the urgency in the girl's voice was undeniable. He reached for the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Sergeant Miller. I'm with a possible witness in the Sterling case. She's claiming to know the location." The voice on the other end of the radio sounded equally skeptical, but he persisted. "She gave me a specific location, an abandoned warehouse near the rail line in the industrial district. I'm checking it out." He clicked off the radio and looked at Leah, his face now a mixture of doubt and a new seriousness. "All right, kid, you're going to show me the way, but I swear, if this is some kind of prank..." He left the threat hanging in the air. Leah just nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. The fear was still there, a tight knot in her stomach. But now, mixed in with it, was a thin thread of hope. She didn't know if she was leading the police to a rescue or to her own ruin, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. She started walking, and the sergeant followed, disbelief still visible in every step he took. The journey to the industrial district was tense and silent. Leah led the way, guiding Sergeant Miller through a maze of forgotten streets and back alleys that only someone who lived on the city's margins would know. He followed at a cautious distance, his hand never straying far from the holster at his hip. With every corner they turned, the skepticism on his face seemed to deepen. This was the most decrepit part of the city, a graveyard of rusted-out factories and empty warehouses, a perfect place to hide, but also a place where a street kid's imagination could easily run wild. Other patrol cars, alerted by Miller's radio call, began to converge on the area, their sirens off so as not to alert anyone who might be inside. Their presence added to the pressure on Leah. She could feel the other officers' eyes on her, gazes that judged her, measured her, and found her untrustworthy. Her heart pounded, a drum of anxiety. What if she was wrong? What if the van had gone somewhere else after she lost sight of it? Doubt began to gnaw at her confidence. Finally, she stopped. Before them stood a tall iron gate, eaten away by rust. In the center, nearly obscured by time, was the design of an eagle in mid-flight. "This is it," Leah whispered, her voice trembling. Sergeant Miller looked at the gate, then at her, and for an instant, the doubt in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of respect. He signaled to the other units, who quietly took up positions around the perimeter. The place was a labyrinth of concrete and twisted metal, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through broken windows. The officers moved with practiced precision, weapons drawn. Leah was told to stay back near one of the patrol cars. She huddled next to the tire, hugging her knees. The fear she'd felt before was a pale shadow of the terror that gripped her now. Shots could be fired, people could get hurt, and it was all because she couldn't stay quiet. She heard the sound of screeching metal as they breached the gate. She watched the dark figures of the police disappear inside the compound. The minutes crawled by, each second an eternity. She held her breath, waiting for a shout, a gunshot, anything. But there was only silence, a heavy, menacing silence. After what felt like a lifetime, one of the officers came running back out. He yelled something into his radio, the urgency in his voice making Leah's stomach clench. More officers ran inside. What was happening? The waiting was torture. Finally, Sergeant Miller reappeared, his face pale and grim. He walked directly toward her. "You were right, kid. He's here." Overwhelming relief washed over her, so strong that her legs gave out. She nearly collapsed, but Miller caught her by the arm. "But we have a problem, a big one." He led her closer to the entrance of the main warehouse, where a frantic energy was taking hold. Other officers were clearing a path, and she could see what they'd found. In the center of the vast, dusty space was a metal shipping container. It was locked with a series of heavy padlocks and thick chains. "He's in there," Miller said, his voice low. "We got a fiber optic camera through a gap. He's tied up." Leah felt a chill, but the sergeant wasn't finished. "Look over there," he said, pointing to where some officers were setting up heavy equipment to cut through the metal. "Now look over there." Leah looked and saw a group of people in different uniforms, wearing bomb-proof vests, rushing toward the container. The terror returned with full force. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sergeant Miller looked at her, his face grim. "They locked him inside. But that's not all. Next to him, there's a device, and it's counting down." Miller's sentence hung in the dusty warehouse air, heavy with a terrifying weight. "Counting down." The words echoed in Leah's mind, conjuring images from movies and news reports she'd only ever glimpsed through the windows of electronics stores. But this wasn't a screen. This was real, cold, and happening just a few yards away. The deafening shriek of a metal saw cutting through the container's chains began to echo through the warehouse, a desperate soundtrack to the chaotic scene. Cops yelled orders. The bomb squad, moving with a deliberate calm that contrasted violently with the urgency of the situation, prepped their gear. Leah felt as if the floor was opening up beneath her. Had she saved Arthur Sterling only to lead him into a deadlier trap? Guilt hit her with the force of a wave. If she'd stayed in her alley, none of this would be happening. But another, weaker voice whispered that if she hadn't spoken up, no one would even know he was in there, racing against time. The chains and padlocks finally gave way with a metallic crack. Officers forced the heavy container door open, revealing the grim scene inside. Even from a distance, Leah could see the silhouette of a man in a chair, his body immobilized by thick ropes. The beams of police flashlights danced over the duct tape, covering his mouth, and the sinister gleam of an electronic device strapped to the chair beside him. Bright red numbers stood out in the gloom. One of the bomb squad technicians, his face obscured by a heavy helmet, yelled to the others, "9 minutes! We've got 9 minutes!" Time seemed to speed up and slow down all at once. Every second was precious, yet the waiting was agony. Sergeant Miller pulled her back, positioning her behind a stack of old wooden crates, creating a makeshift barrier. "Stay here and don't move," he ordered, before running to help coordinate the evacuation of non-essential personnel. Leah obeyed, her body trembling. From her hiding spot, she had a clear, if fragmented, view of the operation. She saw the technicians approaching the container with extreme caution. She heard the technical terms they shouted to one another. Words that meant nothing to her, but whose tone was universally understood as grave. "The circuit's complex," one of them yelled. "This isn't a standard model. It looks custom-made." The hope that had bloomed in her chest when they found the warehouse began to wither, replaced by an icy dread. This wasn't a simple kidnapping for money. This was something else, more personal, more vicious. The minutes ticked by, each one announced aloud by a technician, marking the rhythm of the race against death. 6 minutes. The sound of the saw was replaced by the delicate clicking of tools and the low hum of electronic equipment. Leah clasped her hands together in a prayer, a gesture she hadn't made in years. She wasn't praying for herself. She was praying for the kind man she barely knew, but whose life was now terribly intertwined with her own. 4 minutes! One of the techs swore loudly. "The wiring is a maze. One wrong move and this whole place goes up." The tension was palpable, an electricity that made the air vibrate. Leah could see Arthur Sterling's chest rising and falling rapidly. Even while bound, he was terrified, but he was alive. For now. 2 minutes! Sweat beaded on Sergeant Miller's face as he watched from a safe distance, his helplessness visible. He glanced in Leah's direction, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second. In that look, she saw the same fear she felt. They were partners in this desperate race, connected by a fragile thread of fate. 1 minute! The technician's voice was strained, almost a whisper. Everyone held their breath. The silence in the warehouse was absolute, broken only by the soft, steady beep of the device, an electronic heart beating its final moments. Leah squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch. She waited for the boom, the shockwave, the end. 30 seconds! She buried her face in her knees, hands clamped over her ears. 10, 9, 8. The final count began. Each number a hammer blow to her nerves. She braced for the inevitable. Her body curled into a ball of pure terror. 3, 2, 1... The silence that followed was louder and more shocking than any explosion. The silence stretched for a second, then 2, growing heavy and thick like the dust in the air. Leah kept her eyes squeezed shut, her body still tensed, waiting for the impact that never came. Slowly, she dared to open them. The scene in the center of the warehouse was frozen, like a photograph. The bomb squad techs were motionless, hunched over the device. Then, one of them slowly straightened up, lifted the visor of his helmet, and let out a cry that tore through the stillness. "Disarmed! It's disarmed!" The tension that had gripped everyone snapped like a frayed rope. A chorus of relieved sighs and exhausted exclamations filled the warehouse. Cops hugged each other, others leaned against the walls, visibly shaken. Leah felt her strength leave her, and she let herself slide to the floor. Her legs turned to jelly. She'd done it. They'd done it. He was alive. Paramedics rushed to the container, cutting the ropes that bound Arthur Sterling and removing the tape from his mouth. He coughed, gulping the warehouse air as if it were the purest elixir. His eyes, once filled with terror, now scanned the room, trying to make sense of it all. As they lifted him from the container and onto a stretcher, his gaze swept past the crowd of uniforms and landed on the small figure huddled by the crates. His eyes met Leah's. Even from a distance, she could see the confusion turn to recognition and then to a wave of gratitude so intense it made her look away, abashed. He said something to one of the paramedics, who in turn spoke to Sergeant Miller. Moments later, the sergeant was beside her, holding out a hand. "He wants to talk to you," Miller said, his voice soft now. Stripped of all its earlier skepticism, Leah hesitated, then took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Her legs were still shaking as Miller led her to the stretcher. Up close, Arthur Sterling looked older and more fragile than he had on stage. There were bruises on his wrists and a cut on his forehead, but his eyes shone with a renewed clarity. "It was you," he said, his voice hoarse and weak. "You're the one who led them here, weren't you?" Leah could only nod, unable to find her voice. "What's your name, child?" he asked gently. "Leah," she whispered. "Leah." He repeated the name, as if committing it to memory. "Leah, you saved my life. I can never..." I can never thank you enough." Tears welled in the billionaire's eyes. "Anything you want, anything you need, a home, an education, money, it's yours. Consider it done." The offer was staggering, a universe of possibilities that Leah's mind could barely process. A home, a safe place, food every day, an end to fear. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. A wave of euphoria washed over her. But then, something made her hesitate. Outside the warehouse, hidden in the shadows, other eyes were watching. Eyes that didn't belong to the police. Two figures observing the operation from a distance, their faces contorted with rage. They saw the skinny girl being led to the businessman. They saw the gesture of gratitude, and they understood everything. Their meticulously crafted plan had been foiled by a street kid. The information spread quickly through channels the police didn't monitor. In the city's underbelly, where revenge is currency, a new target was set. Leah, oblivious to this new threat, felt the first true spark of hope in years. She looked at Arthur Sterling's kind face and, for the first time, allowed herself to dream of a future away from the streets, away from the cold and the hunger. The promise of a new life felt so real, so within her grasp. She was about to accept, to let the joy overflow, when she noticed a subtle movement at the edge of her vision, just outside one of the warehouse's broken windows. It was just a flicker, a dark shape against the grey morning light that was gone as quickly as it appeared. It was probably just a cop, or a curious onlooker. But a shiver ran down her spine. A silent alarm honed by years of living in danger. The instinct that had kept her alive for so long screamed that something was wrong. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable, and the gaze she felt on her was not one of curiosity. It was cold, calculating, and filled with hate. The euphoria vanished instantly, replaced by a terrifying realization. In saving Arthur Sterling's life, she may have just signed her own death warrant. Arthur Sterling's promise echoed in her mind, a melody of hope in the midst of chaos. A home, an education, security. Words that, to Leah, were more valuable than all the gold in the world. As the paramedics prepared him for transport, he insisted on keeping Leah close, holding her hand with a surprising strength for someone who had just endured such a trauma. "Don't let her go," he repeated to Sergeant Miller. "She's the key to everything. We have to protect her." The attention was bewildering. Suddenly, she was no longer invisible. She was the center of a hurricane, and the powerful winds of change were beginning to blow. At the hospital, while Arthur was being examined, Leah was taken to a small waiting room, guarded by a police officer. They gave her a sandwich and a glass of juice, the first decent meal she'd had in days, but she could barely swallow. The image of that shadow in the warehouse window wouldn't leave her mind. The sense of danger was like an itch under her skin, a dark premonition that tainted the joy of the rescue. Hours later, a sharp man in an expensive suit entered the room. He introduced himself as Ricardo, Arthur Sterling's head of personal security. His eyes were sharp and analytical, and he looked her up and down with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Mr. Sterling has personally tasked me with your security, Leah," he said, his voice professional and devoid of emotion. "He is immensely grateful and wants to ensure you have everything you need. We'll arrange for secure accommodations, clothes, everything." Ricardo began asking questions about what she had seen, about the kidnappers, about the van. Leah answered as best she could, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought of her few belongings hidden in the alley, of the familiar faces of other homeless people with whom she sometimes shared a piece of bread. How could she just vanish? The world Ricardo described, of luxury hotels and armored cars, seemed as distant and alien as the moon. "For now," Ricardo continued, "it's best we keep you out of the public eye. The media is going to go insane with this story. A mysterious hero. They'll want to know who you are." The idea terrified her. Being the center of attention was the opposite of everything she knew. Invisibility was survival. Exposure was danger. "I don't want," she began, but her voice trailed off. "Don't worry," Ricardo said, perhaps misinterpreting her fear. "We'll handle everything. Mr. Sterling wants to make a public announcement to thank you and offer a large reward for information leading to the criminals. It'll be a way to show his gratitude and help the police." And right there, in that sentence, was the turning point, the declaration that, though born of the purest gratitude, would seal her fate in a way no one could have predicted. Leah felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "No," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "Please, don't do that." Ricardo looked at her, surprised. "But why?" "It's a chance to find these men and—" "They'll know it was me," she cut him off, panic rising in her throat. "If Mr. Sterling says a girl helped him, they'll hunt me down. I saw them. Not their faces, but they saw me. I felt it." Ricardo frowned, a hint of condescension in his gaze. "Leah, you will be safe. You will have the best protection money can buy. No one will be able to touch you." But Leah knew something that men like Ricardo, with their high walls and armed guards, didn't understand. She knew the cruel logic of the streets. She knew how revenge worked, silent and relentless. Protecting herself was one thing, but what about the others? The old woman who sold flowers on the corner, the young boy who shared her shelter on rainy days? They wouldn't have protection. They would become targets, tools to get to her. Despite her protests, the decision was already made. That same night, from his hospital bed, Arthur Sterling, his heart overflowing with gratitude and a desire for justice, gave an exclusive interview. He told the world about the courage of an anonymous young woman, the Shadow Angel, who had guided him to salvation, and to accelerate the capture of the culprits, he announced the creation of a fund, a multi-million-dollar reward for anyone who provided information. The moment his words hit the airwaves, Leah's world changed forever. She was no longer just a witness, she was a prize. And for the men watching from the shadows, she had become the biggest obstacle standing between them and the fortune they felt they deserved. The target on her back, once invisible, now glowed with the brilliance of millions of dollars. The news exploded like a supernova. Overnight, the story of the Shadow Angel was in every newspaper, on every news channel, in every conversation. Leah, now under Ricardo's tight protection, was moved to a luxury hotel suite, a place so opulent it made her feel even more out of place. The walls were covered in silk, the sheets felt like clouds, and food arrived on silver carts. It was a dream, but to her, it felt like a gilded cage. From the 20th floor window, she watched the city sprawl below, the same city whose guts she knew so well. But now, an invisible barrier separated her from that world. She could no longer wander its streets, could not return to her hiding places. Arthur Sterling's generosity, so publicly expressed, had become her prison. Ricardo and his team were efficient and professional, but cold. They treated her like an asset to be protected, not a person. They spoke of security protocols, escape routes, and 24/7 surveillance. Leah felt suffocated, a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand. Meanwhile, in the city's shadows, the multi-million-dollar reward had an immediate effect. It not only attracted the attention of informants and bounty hunters, but it also solidified the kidnappers' rage. They, who had planned everything with military precision, were now being hunted, and the source of their problems was a single girl. For them, it was no longer just about revenge, it was about silencing the only witness who could conclusively link them to the crime. And they knew exactly how to pressure her. The first message arrived subtly. One of Ricardo's security men, stationed discreetly on the corner where Leah used to sleep, found her threadbare blanket shredded to pieces, a single black rose left on the scraps. Ricardo dismissed it as a coincidence, but Leah knew It was a warning. They knew where she lived. They knew her habits. They knew her. Fear began to seep through the cracks of her gilded cage. She tried to explain to Ricardo that the danger wasn't just to her. "They'll go after other people," she insisted, her voice filled with urgency. "People who know me, people who have no one." Ricardo listened with forced patience. "Leah, we are monitoring the situation. Our resources are vast. No one important to you will be in danger." The word important struck her. To him, the people she was talking about weren't important. They were invisible, just as she used to be. The frustration and helplessness consumed her. She was safe, but at what cost? The second warning was more direct. Old Jonas, a man who collected cans and with whom Leah sometimes spoke, was found with his shopping cart overturned, his entire day's earnings scattered and destroyed. He told anyone who would listen that 2 men had pushed him down, telling him to send a message to the little angel. The police logged it as vandalism, but to Leah, the message was crystal clear. They were tightening the noose, using the one weapon Arthur Sterling's fortune couldn't protect her from, her own heart. Guilt gnawed at her. Jonas had nothing, and now he had even less because of her. Every vulnerable person she knew was now a potential target. Arthur, still recovering, called her every day. His gratitude was immense and genuine. He spoke of his plans for her, a foundation in her name, schools she would help build. He saw her as a symbol of hope. "You've shown us, Leah, that true wealth isn't in the assets we accumulate, but in the courage we possess," he said during one call. His words were kind, but to Leah, they sounded hollow. How could she be a symbol of hope when her very existence was putting others in mortal danger? She was trapped between 2 worlds, the one of wealth and protection that suffocated her, and the one on the streets, where her invisible friends were now paying the price for her courage. The choice before her was impossible. Remain in the safety of her cage, knowing others suffered in her place, or flee and try to protect them herself, diving back into the danger she knew so well. And as she wrestled with this dilemma, the men in the shadows prepared their next move, one that would be far crueler and more personal than a ripped blanket or an overturned cart. Leah's decision ripened during a sleepless night. As she watched the city lights glitter like diamonds spilled on black velvet, she could no longer be a burden, a catalyst for the suffering of the only human connection she'd ever made. Ricardo's protection was a fortress, but its high walls didn't stop her from seeing the devastation she was causing outside. She had to leave, not to return to her old life, but to take the target off the backs of those she cared about. Her escape was planned with the same survival intelligence that had kept her alive on the streets. She watched the guards' patterns, the shift changes, the small gaps in the otherwise impeccable security. On the 3rd night, wearing the simple clothes she had insisted on keeping, she slipped out of her suite, descended 20 flights of service stairs, and exited through a delivery door in the back of the hotel, melting into the darkness like a ghost. Freedom, however, had a bitter taste. The city that was once her home now felt like a minefield. Every shadow was a threat, every alley a potential dead end. She didn't return to her old haunts. She knew they would be the first places watched. Instead, she sought out Maria, the elderly woman who sold flowers near the cathedral. Maria, with her kind eyes and calloused hands, was the closest thing Leah ever had to a grandmother. She found her in her small, one-room apartment behind a flower shop, a place that smelled of damp earth and petals. Maria took her in without question, her wrinkled eyes full of concern. "They are looking for you, child," she said, her voice low. "Bad men. They asked questions, offered money." Leah's heart sank. They had already found her. "I know, Maria. That's why I came. I need to disappear, but first, I have to warn everyone. I need them to stay away from me." For the next 2 days, using Maria as a messenger, Leah tried to spread the word among the city's invisible community. "Stay away from me. Don't say my name. I am danger." Meanwhile, Leah's disappearance caused panic among Arthur Sterling's team. Ricardo was furious, not just at the security breach, but at the girl's stubbornness. Arthur, on the other hand, was heartbroken. "We failed her, Ricardo," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "We put her on a pedestal, turned her into a symbol, and forgot she's just a scared kid. Find her, not to lock her up, but to help her, on her terms." The hunt for Leah now had two fronts: Ricardo's, using technology and paid informants, and the kidnappers, using fear and intimidation. And Leah was in the middle, desperately trying to protect others, not realizing the greatest threat was closing in on the one place she considered safe. On her third night in Maria's apartment, while the old woman slept, Leah heard a sound at the door, not a knock, but a soft, almost inaudible scratching. Her blood ran cold. She crept to the window, peeking through a crack in the curtain. On the dimly lit street, she saw a black van, the same van. Panic seized her. They had found her, and now Maria was in danger. Leah looked at the old woman's sleeping face, serene and peaceful. She couldn't let anything happen to her. In an act of desperation and sacrifice, she made a decision. She silently opened the back door and ran into the darkness of the alley. She didn't run to hide. She ran to be seen. She emerged onto the main street, deliberately stepping under the glow of a streetlight. "Hey!" she yelled, her voice trembling but loud. "I'm over here! It's me you want!" The van doors slid open. Two men jumped out. They weren't masked now. They were just ordinary-looking men, which made them even more frightening. They started walking toward her, slowly, savoring the moment. Leah backed away, drawing them away from Maria's building. She was luring them away, sacrificing her own freedom, maybe her life, to protect the one person who had shown her unconditional kindness. She retreated until her back hit a cold brick wall. She was trapped. The men closed in, a cruel smile on their faces. She closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. But instead of rough hands grabbing her, she heard the sharp squeal of tires and the glare of headlights blinding her. A black sedan screeched to a halt between her and her pursuers. The passenger door flew open. "Get in, now!" Ricardo's voice yelled. For a split second, Leah was frozen, caught between two threats. On one side, the men from the van whose intentions were unequivocally hostile. On the other, Ricardo, the man who represented the gilded cage she had just abandoned. But survival instinct won. She dove into the car, and Ricardo yelled for the driver to go before the door was even fully closed. The tires screamed on the asphalt as the car shot down the street, leaving the two men behind, shrouded in exhaust fumes. Leah huddled in the leather seat, her heart racing. She looked back and saw the black van starting to give chase. "They're coming after us!" she cried. "I know," Ricardo said, his voice surprisingly calm. He picked up a radio. "Target acquired. We are mobile. Active pursuit units. Converge on my position." Red and blue lights began to flash on the horizon, and the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Ricardo had set a trap, and Leah had been the bait. Anger surged through her, overpowering her fear. "You used me," she accused, her voice shaking with outrage. Ricardo looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than professional coldness in his eyes. It was a mix of frustration and grudging respect. "I had no choice, Leah. You gave us no choice. You ran, you put yourself in danger, and you put others at risk. I needed to get you off the streets and draw them into the open." The high-speed chase through the city's night streets was terrifying. Cars honked, pedestrians leaped out of the way. The black van was relentless, staying dangerously close. But Ricardo's net was closing. At an intersection, two police cruisers appeared from nowhere, blocking the van's path. The driver swerved, lost control, and slammed violently into a utility pole. The chase was over. Ricardo directed his driver to keep going, away from the scene as police swarmed the crashed vehicle. They took her to a new location, not a hotel, but a safe house in a quiet suburb, surrounded by high walls and discreet cameras. Inside, Arthur Sterling was waiting for her. He no longer looked like a frail patient, but like the powerful billionaire he was, though his eyes were filled with a fatherly concern. "Leah, you gave us a terrible scare," he said softly. "I understand why you ran. I understand your fear. And I'm sorry, we were arrogant. We thought our money and our power could solve everything, but we forgot to listen to you." It was the most sincere apology Leah had ever received. He was treating her not as a charity project or an asset to be protected, but as an equal. "The police have the two men from the van," Arthur continued, "but they're not the masterminds. They're just pawns, and they won't talk. There's something bigger behind this, Leah. This isn't just a kidnapping for money, it's personal." He paused, looking her in the eyes. "And the only way we're going to find the truth and end this for good is if we work together. But this time, it will be on your terms. You tell us what to do. You know this world. You understand how they think. We have the resources. But you have the wisdom of the streets." The offer stunned her. He wasn't asking her to hide. He was asking for her help. He was valuing her knowledge, her experience, the very things the world had always scorned. For the first time, Leah felt a spark of power, not the power of money or force, but the power that came from being seen, heard, and respected. That night, for the first time in a long time, she slept without nightmares. But in another part of the city, in a lavish office overlooking the skyline, the true architect of the kidnapping received the news of his men's capture. He did not rage. Instead, a cold smile played on his lips. The capture of his pawns was a setback, but also an opportunity. The police and Arthur Sterling were focused on street-level thugs, on the muscle. They weren't looking in the right direction. They weren't looking within their own family. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Plan B," he said, his voice calm and laced with venom. "It's time we get rid of the problem for good, and my uncle, too." The safe house was a command center. City maps covered a mahogany table, and computer screens displayed security camera feeds and encrypted data. For the first time, Leah wasn't being protected. She was part of the strategy. Sitting at the table with Arthur and Ricardo, she felt like a general in an army she never knew she had. Ricardo laid out the facts with his usual precision. The two captured men were career criminals, mercenaries with long rap sheets but no apparent connection to Arthur. They refused to talk, loyal to whoever was paying their bills. "They're a dead end," Ricardo concluded, frustrated. Leah slowly shook her head. "No, they're not," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The two men turned to her. "You're looking for business connections, phone records. You're looking for money, but it's not about that." She stood and pointed to a spot on the map, the place where old Jonas's cart had been destroyed. "And here," she said, pointing to another, the alley where her blanket had been torn. "This wasn't random. It wasn't just to scare me. It was to hurt me, to tell me they could touch the things that matter to me. Whoever is behind this knows me, or has been watching me for a long time. They know I care." Leah's words hung in the air, changing the atmosphere in the room. Arthur Sterling looked at her with a new intensity. Her logic was irrefutable, born not of data, but of empathy and instinct. "She's right, Ricardo," Arthur said, his voice heavy. "This was always personal. That device in the container, it wasn't just to eliminate me. It was meant to terrorize, to be cruel. It's the kind of cruelty that comes from resentment, from something deep." He stepped away from the table, walking to the window, his gaze lost on the manicured garden outside. A flashback hit him, a painful memory he'd kept locked away for years. "My family, my fortune hasn't always united us. Sometimes wealth is what divides us most." He spoke of his late brother and of his brother's son, Daniel, his nephew, a brilliant young man, but consumed by envy. "Daniel never understood my philanthropy. He saw it as a waste of the family's legacy. He said I was diluting his inheritance, throwing away capital that should be generating profit for future generations. We had a terrible fight a few months ago. He accused me of being weak, of not understanding real business. A shocked silence filled the room. Ricardo stared at Arthur, his eyes wide. "Sir, are you suggesting your own nephew?" The possibility was monstrous, almost unthinkable. But in light of Leah's words about the personal nature of the attacks, it all began to make a terrible kind of sense. The sophistication of the plan, the access to inside information about Arthur's schedule, the calculated cruelty. It was the revenge of someone who felt deeply wronged, someone who saw Arthur not as an uncle, but as an obstacle to the wealth he believed was his by right. Just as this devastating realization settled over them, a small beep sounded in the room. It didn't come from any of Ricardo's equipment. It came from a simple, prepaid burner phone that Ricardo had given Leah for emergencies, a supposedly secure channel. She pulled the phone from her pocket, her brow furrowed in confusion. No one was supposed to have that number. She looked at the screen. A new message had arrived. Leah's face drained of all color. The blood seemed to vanish from her veins, leaving behind a mask of pure horror. Her hand began to shake so violently that the phone almost fell. "Leah, what is it?" Arthur asked, taking a step toward her. Without a word, she turned the phone so they could see. On the screen was a photo. It was a little boy, maybe 7 years old, with big, frightened eyes. It was Leo, one of the street kids Leah had protected like a little brother. He was huddled in a dark corner, and in his small hands, he clutched a worn-out teddy bear she had given him herself. Beneath the photo, a single line of text glowed ominously. "The carousel at the abandoned amusement park. 1 hour. Come alone, or the boy disappears for good." The photograph on the phone screen was a neutron bomb, annihilating all strategy and calm in the room, leaving only raw, naked panic. The air grew thin, hard to breathe. Ricardo immediately reached for the phone, but Leah clutched it with a strength he didn't know she possessed. "No!" she hissed, her eyes locked on Leo's image. "If they know you've seen this, they'll hurt him." Arthur Sterling, pale as a ghost, leaned on the table for support. "My God, Daniel, to use a child!" The monstrosity of his nephew's act was a chasm he couldn't comprehend. The revenge plot wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was rotten to its core. "It's a trap, Leah. You can't go," Ricardo said, his voice low and tight, snapping back into security professional mode. "It's exactly what they want." "And what do you suggest I do?" she shot back, the horror in her voice twisting into an icy fury. "Stay here, safe, while they harm a 7-year-old boy. I'm not doing that, I'm going." Her determination was absolute, a steel wall forged in the fires of survival and loyalty. She knew the code of the streets. You don't abandon your own, ever. "You won't go alone," Arthur said, his voice firm, regaining his composure. "But they said," Leah started. "They lie," Arthur cut her off. "We can't trust a word they say, but you're right. You have to be the one to walk in. They're expecting you. Ricardo, assemble the team, our quietest. No uniforms, no marked cars. But Leah, you need to give us an advantage." It was then that Leah's mind, trained to find escape routes and blind spots, kicked into high gear. The panic gave way to a sharp focus. "The abandoned amusement park. I know that place. It's where I used to hide when the rain was bad. I know every piece of rusted metal, every loose floorboard." She turned to the map on the table, her finger tracing routes that didn't exist on any official blueprint. "There's a broken fence in the back, near the old creek bed. You can get in there without making a sound. The carousel is in the center, but the House of Mirrors is to the left. The glass is filthy, but from certain angles, you can see the center of the park without being seen." She spoke with an authority that silenced both men. This was her arena. "I'll go in the front, like they want." I'll wear a wire. When I'm sure Leo is safe, I'll give the signal. I'll say, the bear looks tired. It's the name Leo gave his teddy bear. When you hear that, you move in. The plan was risky, thin as a spider's thread, but it was the only one they had. 20 minutes later, Leah was walking toward the park's rusted gates. The sound of her own footsteps on the gravel was the only thing breaking the ghostly silence. The skeletal frames of a roller coaster and a Ferris wheel rose against the night sky like the bones of dead leviathans. In the center, the carousel's pale, sickly lights were on, turning slowly without music, a nightmarish vision. She saw the figure waiting for her. It was Daniel, in the flesh. He wore an arrogant smirk, the kind of smile worn by someone who believes they've already won. And next to him, huddled and crying silently, was Leo, punctual. "I like that," Daniel said, his voice smooth and venomous. "You see, Uncle Arthur never really understood investment. He throws our family's fortune away, while I see the true potential. You were a liability, a problem for my cash flow. But now, you're going to solve everything." Leah ignored his words, her eyes fixed on Leo. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's perfect. For now," Daniel replied. "Now, we're going to wait for the police to arrive. You're going to tell them this was all a misunderstanding, that I'm the victim here." His arrogance was his weakness. Leah knew it. She took a step closer, her eyes welling with tears. "Leo," she whispered, looking at the toy in the boy's hands. "The bear looks tired." It was the signal. A subtle rustle came from the shadows. Blinding lights erupted from all directions. "Police! Freeze!" voices yelled. Daniel's smirk dissolved into a mask of panicked fury. He was surrounded. For a moment, it looked like Leah's plan had worked perfectly, but then, in an act of animal desperation, Daniel lunged forward. He didn't grab Leah. He grabbed the small, terrified Leo, yanking the boy against him and pressing something cold and metallic to his temple. Time froze. The blinding police lights cast long shadows that danced like specters among the rusted-out rides. The entire world had shrunk to this one. Terrible drama under the carousel's glow. A desperate man, a terrified child, and the cold gleam of metal against the soft skin of a temple. The armed officers were paralyzed. One wrong move, and tragedy was inevitable. Ricardo spoke quietly into his comms, his voice tense but controlled. Arthur Sterling watched from the shadows, his face a mask of anguish and disbelief, seeing his own blood threaten an innocent life. "Stay back!" Daniel shrieked, his voice high-pitched with panic. "I swear, stay back. This is his fault, him and his stupid altruism, giving away our legacy, our inheritance." The man who had planned everything with such calculating coldness was now just a cornered, spoiled boy, spitting accusations to deflect blame. In this moment of absolute tension, a cold clarity washed over Leah. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but her mind was sharp. She was the only one who could reach Leo. She took a step forward, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. "Daniel, please, let the boy go. He has nothing to do with this." "He has everything to do with this," he screamed. "He's your weakness, just like Charity is my uncle's weakness." Leah realized reason wouldn't reach him. He was lost in his own resentment, so she stopped talking to him. She looked directly into Leo's big, tear-filled eyes. She needed the boy to hear her, to trust her more than the fear that paralyzed him. "Leo," she said, her voice soft and calm, as if it were just the two of them, sitting in some alley, sharing a piece of bread. "Remember our #1 rule. We always take care of Tired Bear, right?" Leo sniffled, nodding minutely, his small body trembling in Daniel's grip. "Tired Bear doesn't like loud noises, Leo. And he's very, very scared right now," Leah continued, holding his gaze. "I think he needs to go to sleep. He needs a quiet place. Can you put him to sleep on the ground very gently?" Daniel watched her, confused, not understanding what she was doing. To him, it was just nonsensical talk about a toy. But to Leo, It was an instruction from the one person in the world he trusted. With his eyes still locked on Leah's, the little boy loosened his grip on the teddy bear. The worn-out toy dropped to the ground with a soft thud. The sound was almost nothing, but in the tense silence, it was enough. For a split second, Daniel's eyes darted down to the bear on the ground. It was the only mistake Ricardo's team needed. From the shadows, agents moved with feline speed. Before Daniel could even register what was happening, he was tackled, his arm twisted behind his back, and the metal object in his hand, a heavy metal keychain, not a gun, clattered harmlessly to the ground. In the same instant, Leah rushed forward, ignoring everything else. She fell to her knees and wrapped Leo in her arms, pulling him close, shielding him from the chaos. He clung to her, sobbing, his small body finally allowing itself to collapse. She held him tight, burying her face in his hair, whispering words of comfort, relief flooding her in waves so powerful they left her breathless. The nightmare was over. As the police cuffed a stunned and defeated Daniel, Arthur slowly approached. He didn't look at his nephew, but at the scene before him. The girl he had tried to protect, now protecting another, the circle of courage and compassion complete. The law had prevailed, but the real victory here wasn't about arrests or criminal justice. It was about the strength of a bond forged in adversity, a bond that wealth couldn't buy and that malice couldn't break. The fourth week after the kidnapping found a city transformed, not in its concrete landscape, but in its heart. The story of Leah, the shadow angels, and Daniel, the resentful nephew, dominated the headlines, but the real deeper narrative unfolded far from the cameras. The legal case against Daniel was swift. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he had no choice but to confess. The public was shocked by the family drama, fueled by greed and envy, a story of how one man's immense fortune nearly led to his ruin at the hands of his own family. But for Leah and Arthur, the justice of the courts was just a distant echo of the true resolution they sought. Arthur, in an act of gratitude and recognition, didn't simply offer Leah money or a house. He offered her something infinitely more valuable, a choice and a platform. He established the Urban Angels Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing shelter, education, and support for homeless youth. And he appointed Leah, at just 17, to its advisory board. Her first victory wasn't watching Daniel get convicted. It was ensuring Maria, the flower seller, had her apartment paid off and a small pension to live with dignity. Her second victory was creating, through the foundation, a safe and welcoming shelter where Leo and other children could sleep without fear, with warm beds and food on the table. She was no longer a fugitive or a target, but an advocate. Maria's small, dusty home was exchanged for a simple, clean apartment in a quiet neighborhood, a place Leah could call home. The once bare walls now featured colorful drawings by Leo and photos of her and Arthur, smiling during a visit to one of the foundation's new facilities. Leah went back to school, not at an elite prep school, but at a night program, sitting alongside others who, like her, were looking for a second chance. Her wisdom didn't come from textbooks, but from the streets. And she used that experience to shape the Foundation's programs, ensuring they were practical, compassionate, and treated each young person as an individual, not a statistic. 4 weeks after that terrible evening at the charity gala, Leah was back in the same ballroom. This time, she wasn't hiding in the shadows, but standing on the stage next to Arthur Sterling at the official launch of the Urban Angels Foundation. She wore a simple dress, but her eyes shone with a confidence that no jewelry could ever match. She spoke, not with the eloquence of a trained orator, but with the raw honesty of someone who had lived the truth. She spoke of invisibility, of fear, but above all, of the resilience and hope that flourish in the darkest of places. Arthur had learned that his greatest wealth wasn't in his vast estate, his stocks, or his assets. His true treasure was human connection. The ability to see the value in a girl the world had thrown away. He understood that the best investment he could ever make wasn't on the stock market, but in the life of a child. The girl who once begged for change was now managing a cash flow of hope, turning the foundation's capital into changed lives. At the end of the evening, Leah stood on the balcony, looking out at the illuminated city. Arthur joined her. "You know, Leah," he said, his voice soft, "sometimes the worst storms bring the best harvests." She looked at him, a small smile on her lips. "And sometimes," she replied, "the poorest person in the world can teach you what real wealth is." Together, they watched the lights, not as a billionaire and a former homeless girl, but as two survivors, two souls who had found, in the midst of chaos and pain, a shared purpose and an unlikely friendship. Her courage hadn't just transformed her own life, it had transformed a community, proving that a single act of bravery, no matter how small, can light a fire bright enough to guide many out of the darkness.